So hello, welcome to another live edition of Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the live stream that gives you a peek inside the minds of some truly inspirational teachers. Tonight I'm joined once again by Amy Bills. Hello Amy, how are you?
Hello, good, thank you. You?
Yeah, all good. And I don't think I'm as tired as you might be right now. Long week.
Special visitors, Kieran, special visitors.
So the focus of tonight's stream will be CPaL, which is a pedagogical approach to the teaching of mathematics that involves exploring ideas via concrete or pictorial representations in the hope that connections can be made with the abstract mathematics that we manipulate in our minds. And we're going to find out what Amy's teachers learned during the CPD based on the chapter in Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics. And I promised I'm going to take us a little further beyond the book at the end. But feel free to ask questions in the chat, share your opinions, support each other, because that's what it's there for. So Amy, last week you met with your subject leaders. Generally speaking, how did it go?
Yeah, great session. So we were able to think for them as the maths experts in their schools, how can we take this and use the time together to support them, to support the colleagues that they're working with in their schools. So it's a real key focus for everybody this year. And, as we've said before, we're trying to focus all of our trust-wide CPD on those things that we know are going to benefit everybody. And this is definitely one of them. So thank you again. Yeah, no, it's really useful, really good conversation.
And what sort of breadth of experience were your subject leaders bringing to the table?
So with a range of primary schools and a range of experience in terms of maths leadership. So we've got a couple of colleagues who are just starting out on that journey this year, brand new to maths leadership. And some colleagues who are really experienced leaders in terms of time, some who are leading groups of schools through Maths Hub and that kind of thing. So actually, it's a fantastic group to be able to bring together for people to be able to share that, and help each other.
Excellent. Yes, you've got that breadth. You can draw on the experiences that people have had throughout their careers and get a really rich tapestry going. I think you focused on the sort of 4 key principles that I outlined in the book, and you plan on revisiting some of them going forward. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to spend 2 sessions on this particular chapter. The 2 reasons, really, it's quite a meaty chapter, but also it's the bread and butter of teaching maths, isn't it? So we want to give some proper time to it. So we unpicked the 4 key aspects within that chapter, really talked them through, thought about some sharing of resources that we could use back in schools with colleagues, and then the same focus next time. And we'll come back with hopefully some reflections on how that's gone, anything that folks feel have gone particularly well that we can share with each other, but also anything that's proven to be a bit of a challenge that colleagues can wrestle with together and try and problem solve.
Yeah, I think that's wise because, like you said, it's a pedagogical approach that you're taking across your trust, and it's not something that you're going to change overnight. You don't just suddenly, as I say in the book, do CPaL.
Yeah. And it's, it's that constant battle. I think particularly everybody's really stretched and time is precious, but I think particularly in primary, it's hard for colleagues to find time to have some specific subject knowledge development for their particular subject because everyone's fighting for those slots. So I'm also conscious of giving enough time for people to be able to go and, have some meaningful conversations with it and then come back and seek some further guidance.
Nice. I think probably best to look at what sort of the big takeaways were for your teachers in terms of the key principles and maybe the questions that arose, because then maybe if there are any questions that came up, we can maybe take them on tonight. So I think if we start with representing the inherent mathematical structures, next Saturday, Gareth Metcalf and Chris and I are going to talk about manipulatives in uppercase A2, and we explore what we mean by inherent mathematical structures. So I'm not going to answer that question tonight. I'm not going to explain too much. But what were their big takeaways from that? So they were exploring, how we can represent sort of the mathematics underpinning what we're learning about.
So we broke it down into within each of those key themes, breaking that down into smaller steps to really think about the finer detail of it. So we talked about actually selecting the most appropriate aid at the very beginning and sitting that under the umbrella of not shoehorning something in if it doesn't actually represent that structure, and really thinking carefully about the purpose and why we are choosing that structure and what we want it to do. We talked about having to very deliberately consider planning the language that we use, both for the language we want the children to use, but also in our explanation, using that structure, what language is going to be used. And is that language that's already known to the children, or is that also new? And being very mindful of that careful consideration of cognitive load and actually what is the new learning. And it's one thing at a time. And then narrating the relationships. So we've selected the aid, planned the language, and then really clearly narrating the relationships as that model is kind of built in front of the children or used in that first instance to demonstrate. So we talked about the building of that model then, and then we kind of had some time in a group discussion to think about minding the pitfalls. And I think, one of your key messages at the very start is real clear about it's got to be succinct and helpful, or it's probably not the right representation to be using. And a real conversation actually around it's not a calculator. It's not holding a calculation for the children. It's holding a representation that supports understanding. So I hope we got that first part right, but they're the conversations that that we had around that.
I mean, yeah, there's not necessarily a right, but you're definitely sort of ticking off all the things that I have in my head. I think we'll come to the calculator when we look at phasing things out, because that's when you realize that it was a calculator, is when you take it away and you still don't know your 5 times tables or your 6 times tables, and then you're back where you started, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so with your less experienced subject leads, where are they going to explore? What do they do if they want to find out what the right tool for the job is? Are they leaning on the curricula that you have in place and sort of exploring why decisions have been made, or what's their port of call?
So a bit of a two-pronged attack with that, really. All of our schools take part in Maths Hub support groups, so with the NCETM. So that's really powerful because there's a group dialogue there. It's very deliberately mapped, and there's the curriculum is sequenced so that actually the models and representations are clearly mapped alongside the objectives. We've got some schools using set schemes and set curriculum, and some that are perhaps doing a little bit more of that resourcing for themselves. So one of the things that we looked at together was some really useful resources that would be a kind of a bit of a go-to in that sense. So we spent some time on MathSpot, and we spent some time looking into IC Maths and how do we actually make that, because we had this conversation about sometimes that can be quite overwhelming, particularly for our early career teachers, or for a new maths leader advising another teacher on what the best representation is. Sometimes there's too many to choose from, and if there's a little bit of a uncertainty around that, it's a real good conversation that we had, is how do we as maths leaders guide our teachers with that? And again, that's time. So folks were suggesting things like, I'm just going to put something up in the wall on the staff room that's got some key prompt questions that people can kind of reflect on, or in wherever people sit for PPA or whatever. But I think that's, we talked in the previous session about mapping out vocabulary and being really definitive and deliberate about where that sits, and having that same mindset now with some representations and having to think about that.
Yeah, that's music to my ears. Talking about that deliberate choice and having a curriculum that outlines what you're going to use. Because like you say, you're not going to use every representation that's possible. You're going to choose the ones that you have decided are important for your pupils and can get those connected. I think, it sounds like you are a math specialist in disguise, Amy, sometimes.
Just love it. I love maths, but I'm no specialist at all. No.
Were there any questions?
Sorry, that we talked about, actually, sometimes it's easier to identify the least appropriate representations. And actually, if we need to work through it that way, if we can't immediately select the most appropriate, you always know when that's not doing what I want it to do. And actually we talked about, can we start to just note that down somewhere? We know definitely not that for that. because I think it's as helpful to learn from things that haven't gone particularly smoothly as it is to kind of share things that have gone really well. Just embracing that.
Yeah, because then after a couple of years, you've got this mental model of what works and what doesn't necessarily work in certain situations. Were there any questions that were raised from that part of the conversation?
Not from the selecting as such. No, I know we're going to come on and talk about both scaffolding and deployment, but I think there was just that initial sense of how is best to support colleagues. So there was, a good discussion around that. But I think we're quite lucky. I think sometimes we can have too much to go to in terms of resources and scaffolding. Sometimes it can be a little bit, but no, and that's one of the things that now hopefully there'll be some good conversations in school over the next 6 or 7 weeks before we're back together again, and then we can kind of come and reflect on that together and pick anything up.
Nice. And so what about clarity of explanation and instruction? What were the main talking points with that sort of principle?
Yeah, so we really talked about how important it is to plan and rehearse that explanation, because actually only when you run through it yourself are you able to think, actually, that's probably not the best vocabulary to choose. I can probably exemplify that in a more succinct way. And really practicing, even with, if you're lucky enough, you've got a member of support staff in the classroom with you, you're having a chat and catching up how things were after school. We're going through this tomorrow. Can I just run this by you? Put yourself in the position of a child that struggled today. How's this going to land with them tomorrow? Because what eventually we want is for that explanation and narration for the children to be able to hear that without you actually saying it, because it's then going to become theirs and they're going to be able to articulate it. So, deliberate planning. And we talked a lot about the use of worked examples and how actually we can use that in the explanation. But actually, if we get to a position where there's just a few too many children for us to move on anymore, we can actually use that worked example in different ways and take out different parts of it to support some of the children in the class to practice, but still be challenged while we're continuing that clarity and that explanation with those children who might need a little bit more of the same. Because I think it's really versatile resource, isn't it? A worked example in terms of explanation and to help the children kind of practice. So a lot about that. And actually one of the things that came up was curse of the expert a little bit. And when we're giving that initial explanation, are we actually starting with the thing that is first? Or are we starting with the thing that we are aware is first? If we really, really unpick those really small steps. So again, they're big headings, these bring clarity and instruction, because actually there's a lot underpinning that. So it was really good to take some time to talk through. And we used a couple of examples of actually, what would we say is the first step in this explanation? Is it actually, can we come back even further and do we need to build that up a little bit more?
Yeah, sometimes when I'm thinking things through, I'll have identified step one and then realize actually there are 2 or 3 steps that come before this.
Yeah.
That I really need to, not assume that the pupils have sort of picked up on naturally. I think the clarity is, you mentioned cognitive load. I know Gareth mentions cognitive load a few times whenever I talk to him about this. And I think it's key that you're almost outsourcing part of your working memory to this representation, where it's going to hold like a really big chunk of information, and allow you to focus your attention in 3 or 4 different directions, whatever's necessary in that moment. And I think, you can't understate if you are not clear in terms of your representation, and the confusion that you might sow, and I've done it myself a million times in my career, really, it's only through practice and observation of the pupils do you say, oh, actually, no, this is the clear sense I can explain this with,
Yeah, and I think going back to that selection of the representation in the first place, if you're really, really clear on why you've chosen that representation and why that's really helpful and appropriate, I think that in turn then strengthens the clarity of your explanation, because what you're kind of, that thought process is, right, I don't want you to hold the numbers because I'm going to put those, we're going to represent those here, we're going to hold those here. I don't need you to hold the structure because we're going to put this in the bar model here or whatever it is. The only thing I want you to wrestle with or hold is the process of using those things that are being held elsewhere. So yeah, definitely. And I think that also really helps, I think, for teachers' cognitive load when actually delivering it and planning it, because let's face it, you know, if ever there's a potential for that not going brilliantly, you've got 30 unpredictable small people in front of you. Potentially you've got some, you know, quite handy nifty little resources out on tables. Now you can have the strongest classroom climate and routines in the world, but actually there's a lot for you at the front whilst modelling or narrating that thought process to think about. So also, I think the clearer and the better rehearsed that is, I think the more confident teachers are going to be in that as well.
Yeah, I had an experience like that last term. The visualizer I was using was in reverse. So we tried writing place value headings in reverse, and I couldn't do I couldn't use the representation because it was backwards. It was all, this is backwards. And in my head I was going, I can't do this. So I needed to stop and then just sort of find an alternative mode that I could use, because this backwards camera was really over, you know, it was just like absolute meltdown, you know. So I can imagine what new and beginning teachers feel like, or people who this is new to.
Yeah, or even, you know, if you're using a particular resource that's new that day. So it's funny because we were going through, we'd got some time in breakout rooms and we were actually on MathSpot at the time and it'd just been updated. So I said, oh, look what it can do now. You can group this together and look at, you know. So we were on that, and I was thinking then actually, if I hadn't realised that and I'd just gone to use that in a lesson and that's magically done something I wasn't aware it could do, actually even something like that, if you know, this colleague low in confidence or whatever, is enough, isn't it? So I think the more rehearsed we can be, the stronger. And I think also you pick up on in that part of that chapter, there's a, you know, the representation is going to either draw attention very deliberately to partitive or quantitative, and actually having that really clear for yourself as well in that explanation, that's kind of strengthening the what is it that the representation's holding versus what the children are focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, I like the partitive and quantitative description, not just because it's mathematically accurate, but because when I'm tired, I will get grouping and sharing confused. I think it's very easy to, you know, get muddled in your head what's happening. So, you know, if I'm thinking about quoted division, it's much clearer, I think, you know, certainly when you're exhausted. And, yeah, I think, big shout out for MathSpot. Johnny's done some amazing work recently. And, you know, it's always been amazing, but recently, you know, he's just been powering through, and the subitizing sort of page that he's made, you know, looks amazing. And even people were saying, can you do this? And he's all, yeah, okay, you know. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Yeah, so, and actually it was brilliant timing because I'd spotted it on Twitter, and then we were in this the next day. So it was good just to flag up to people, you know, which again, it's little things like that, I think, which is what makes a group like this so powerful as well. People will spot things, and, you know, it takes a 30-second share and it might have helped, you know, there's, well, we've got 17 potentially maths leaders. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. And then what about deployment? What did you cover in terms of deployment?
So you use a great phrase in here that really just sings to me, because it's about not reserving it for either the youngest or those that struggle the most. And I think we can apply that to so many aspects of our work, actually, that it should not just be early years in Key Stage 1 who need those models and images. I need them and I know I need them. So you know the power of them. And I think the other complexity that we talked through is when selecting the aid, some aids naturally lend themselves to a practical, physical, something on the table resource, and some are very much an image or a representation that perhaps can't be held all the time. But I think where we got to with that was actually just the brilliance and the utility of the bar model, and how actually very, very rarely will there be an occasion where if you need to break something down and represent it in some kind of a way, and you know, you're problem solving in some way, most often you'll be able to use a bar model to support that in some way. But that's actually quite difficult, because that in itself is something that we need to teach our children, in terms of what we actually mean by that. What is that representation, before we actually start attaching value to it. And schools are at different stages with that, so we're all part of the Maths Hub, for example, but there's 4 different stages within that, and folks are on different places in the journey. So again, it's good for them all to kind of wrestle with that with each other and talk that through. But I think the biggest takeaway for us all with that was, we kind of, there is this stereotypical, we use it for younger children, or if they're struggling, go and get a representation. Well, actually, no, lead with the representation, solidify it for everybody, and actively support those children who may have found it difficult otherwise.
Yeah, because quite often the difficulty is the not having immediate access to the key facts, isn't it? And in that situation, they just need to know the key facts. I think, and that's why we wanted to explore Upper Key Stage 2 with Gareth, because it had been requested on the Discord. I think Rachel had asked for, what would you do in that situation? And it comes from everyone having equal access to the same sort of opportunities, in terms of, we're like, if we're prioritizing mathematical structure and the underlying mathematics and being really proficient mathematicians, then everybody follows that journey that that you guys have outlined, and that I think really effective schools outline as well.
Yeah, and I think that'll be super helpful. I think lots of people will find that really, really useful, because I think where colleagues are on that journey, you naturally probably would start with lower down school and build it up. But actually where we are at the moment, there probably will be a bigger need actually further up school to solidify some of those real core concepts or representations that are actually becoming a little bit of a barrier at the minute for some children. So I'm sure people will find that super useful.
Nice, hope so. And then phasing out in the same way that a scaffold comes down, the big one. Neil Almond said to me, it was great that was included, because he hadn't really ever considered. This is when he was reading early drafts and stuff. And so it's one that people do like to talk about. And so one of your teachers had a question about, didn't they?
They did, yeah. So when we were talking about selecting the aid, we watched one of your short videos on the YouTube channel that was about, this isn't a calculator, this is representing structure. So we talked through that, and we were talking about then phasing it out. And there was lots of questions about, actually, how do you know when to start that? How do you know when it's the right time to start phasing it out? And actually, what does that skillful phasing out look like? And what does that then leave you with? And how do you kind of, you talk a lot in that chapter about bridging that gap. It's a bit of a buffer between the representation and the procedure or the strategy, and the mathematical information needed to actually solve the problem or whatever it is. And it talks, about being really explicit with the children about the role that representation has played. This has helped us to see, or to understand, or to conceptualize. So what colleagues were asking, and one in particular contacted me after and said, that video that we looked at is the one for phasing it out? I said, well, no, hold that thought. I'll ask him. So I think it's just that confidence, or when is that right moment, and kind of how is best to gradually take it away in the same thoughtful manner as you've built it up, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And like I was saying to you before we came on, thinking deeply about primary mathematics is my interpretation of the sort of the fundamentals that if we have a grasp on as a teacher or as a subject leader, then we place yourself in a really good position to provide a really high quality maths education, But there's much, much more. And I was also saying I think it was 20,000 words over the word limit when I sent it off. So I couldn't have gone any further into certain points that I really would have quite enjoyed to, but it was fair, because I think it's about 300 pages. I think it's about right, in terms of accessibility and things. So I didn't want to make, because Neil obviously did his really good reading CPD and then the curriculum CPD, and he had the screen up and stuff. But I didn't want to have you here and then press a button and then we all disappear. So what I'll do is what I'm going to talk about next, I will turn into some CPD, and maybe we'll do it on a Wednesday night where we don't have a book to talk about or a chapter to talk
Amazing.
about.
Yeah, fantastic.
But I think when you're talking about phasing the scaffold out, it's all about observation, and you are observing just like you would with anything in the class. I think a large part of what we do is we watch, we listen, we take the information, and then we act on it. And I think there are probably three things that we want to observe. So I think the first one is that the demands that the structure puts on our attention is reduced enough that it's not a burden on the pupils. So if they're looking at the mathematics, whether it be through a problem, whether it be whatever task the teacher has put in front of them, they're able to look at that and interpret the structural properties without thinking about it for 25 minutes or for even just 3 or 4 minutes. Really they look and they recognize the deep structure. I think certainly there will be novel situations where the surface structure distracts them, but in most cases the demand on their attention isn't so great that they're putting all of it into what is the structure here, what am I trying to do. And I think that's the first thing you look for. I think mental manipulation, even with notes. So whenever I talk about mental maths, I'm not talking about solely in your head. They could be making notes, they could be doing calculations on paper or on their whiteboards, but you can see it's visible that mental manipulation is taking place. So once they've interpreted that structure, they're then manipulating that mathematics, without the aid of anything else. And so they know what to do, so they do it. So it's almost a description of being a proficient mathematician, really. And then I think the speed, the third thing, the speed is fluid enough that the processing the whole thing isn't a burden. So you take the whole task as an object and you are able to interact with it in such a way that it feels natural. So there's no one speed. It's not a case of, right, you've got to do this in 5-6 seconds. But you can look at a pupil and their interaction with mathematics, and you can tell if it's burdensome. You can tell if it is, something they're having to put an extreme amount of effort in. And I think if the pace at which they work through a task is fluid, then it's fair to say that you might want to remove the scaffold that you put in place. And I think the caveat I would add is, just because you've taken it down and perhaps it doesn't work, they may still benefit from having that structure in place. You can bring it back in. It's not a case of this is down, right, we're moving on. If it comes down and the whole sort of structure falls apart, the edifice falls apart, bring it back in, and then, like you said earlier on, find out which part of the structure is missing, and then hopefully try and build that bit so that it's strong enough to sustain those three key points. Does that make sense?
Yeah, total sense. And that's really helpful, because having that model in mind as you're phasing it down, actually you might be, like you say, you might be putting part of it back, but not all of it, maybe, especially if you can really sharply identify what aspect of it is making it too burdensome. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. I think the more experience we have, we get better at identifying when a pupil's in that situation. So some of your math leads who've been teaching for 20 odd years will be able to look and survey the class and see, okay, we've got it. But an inexperienced teacher may be working on a one-to-one level. So while they're doing their error tracking, they'll have to really think about, okay, am I noticing the behaviors I want to notice? Am I noticing the behaviors? And then getting the same picture, but just more slowly. And so I think in having an idea, it's a great question that your maths lead asked, having an idea of what are those key behaviors, what's this model that I've got, I think then you're in a better position for building your own fluidity over time.
Yeah. And sharing that explanation there with our maths leaders will help them, because it's a bit like with the whole class of the expert thing, right? You, like you say, as a really experienced maths leader and maths teacher, you know probably that that's what you're looking for, but can you articulate those key things that you've just kind of gone through there is super helpful, because what that will empower them to do is really help others reflect on that. And probably I would imagine when we've got coaching going on, when we've got going and looking at children learning and trying to look at where barriers are and how we can support with that, there's a real key, that's a real key 3 focus areas there to look at in that particular part of a maths sequence of learning that will help coaching people's practice, but will also help support children's understanding. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
It's all right. And what I'll do is I'll put that together with some examples that hopefully illuminate what I mean. And then, like I say, I'll come back on a Wednesday when we don't have a book or anything.
Yeah.
And so I can see Shannon's in the chat. She said it sounds like it's a really good group, really great group to be part of. You're
welcome anytime, Shannon.
You should definitely get Shannon up to Coventry. And then suppose you get Neil Almond as well. So that'd be, fantastic for the trust, wouldn't it? So I think if anyone else has any questions, throw them in the chat. And what we'll do is the usual sharing what's coming up next, because I think the next one we have, Amy, 24th of November, we've got the March Model of Learning by Nimish Ladd, 8 p.m. GMT this time. And I've got 2 weeks then to make sure I finish this book.
Yeah. We're talking about it earlier on today, actually, because I think a lot of people instantly think, you hear Rosenshine being talked about and people switch on straight away. But what I love about this is actually, I think it's a bit of a precursor to it. And I think actually this is a real good way into some of that stuff as well. But Nimish is fantastic. He's super generous, super helpful. So yeah, looking forward to him joining us for that.
Excellent. It sounds like it's going to be great. And I think Chris Such has definitely talked to me about how much he loves the Marge model. And so I'm really looking forward to A, finishing the book, and B, listening to what your book club sort of found out. Shannon said that she'd love to come and visit one day. So yeah, I think we should make that a thing. We'll come up. But I suppose all that's left to say then, Amy, is thank you very much for joining me again.
Thank you for the invite again.
Always a pleasure. And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for watching.